Good morning, NSF. Welcome. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Maureen McCarthy. I'm the program director for the National Security Forum. We have a fabulous program today. I'm really glad to see everybody's out. By popular demand, you said you wanted to hear about the southern border, so I guarantee you're going to hear lots of good stuff. Our speakers, Elina Treyger from RAND Corporation. She's going to give us an overview of the status of what's going on. She wrote that excellent primer that I put in the announcement. Michael Kagan is from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, also professor at UNLV in the School of Law, also the director of the Immigration Clinic at UNLV. He will give you some insight as to how the asylum process works or doesn't when it doesn't. We'll be followed up with Casey Keckler, who is our very own intelligence and analysis representative from the Department of Homeland Security and local. Casey will give you a little bit of description about IA's role out here in Reno, and then also explain what the threats are at the border.
Thank you so much, Maureen, and thank you all for having me. I'm going to start with the obligatory disclaimer that the views I'm presenting are my own and don't represent the views of the RAND Corporation. And what I'm going to do today is talk about some of the basic trends that make the situation at the US-Mexico land border such a challenge for the US, and then a little bit about the types of policies that have been discussed to deal with that challenge and sort of how we can assess them and how we can think about them. What's happening at the border? There's one key fact that's often reported and that many people focus on. It's just the sheer number of encounters at the US borders is at historic highs. And that's true enough. You hear a lot numbers cited, right? There's over 3 million encounters overall in 2023. About 2.5 million of them are at the US-Mexico Southwest land border. And one of the things that I think is striking is when you see this over time, right? The magnitude of the increase since about 2014 is quite monumental. One thing I want to emphasize is what exactly we're looking at. What is this showing? And what it's showing is the number of encounters. Now, an encounter is basically an attempt to enter the United States without prior or proper authorization that's met by an enforcement action by the DHS. Right? The number of encounters, it's not the same as the number of people. Many people are encountered, then they're returned, and then they try to enter again, so they're encountered again. So a lot of people are counted here multiple times. The other thing to keep in mind as we consider these numbers is that many of the people are promptly repatriated and they don't necessarily come back, right? So these numbers are high, but they don't mean that there's literally 3 million new people who entered the country and are still here in 2023, right? The number that actually entered, it's probably less than about 50% of that. Now, the other thing I want to point out is that these trends are not unique to the United States. The world as a whole is seeing likely the highest volume of displacement of people on the move since World War II. There's record numbers of immigrants to all rich Western countries, including near record numbers of asylum seekers to the EU. The number of refugees globally is at a post-World War II peak, and migration in the Western Hemisphere in particular is very high. And all this indicates that at least some of the dynamics and the challenges that we're seeing in the United States are not due to some uniquely American factor. This is a shared challenge. To sort of appreciate a little bit about how the migration flows present a challenge for us at the border, it's useful to see who's coming exactly. So what we're seeing is a more diverse migration flow than we saw a decade ago. So in early 2000, it was primarily people from Mexico. In the 2010s, like in 2014, it's Mexico and the Northern Triangle countries. That's Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. Together, they produce like a lion's share of all the encounters. Now, but last year, over 50% of migrants came from other countries. Now, much of that is still Western Hemisphere, Latin American countries, but a growing percentage are now not even from the Americas. It used to be predominantly single adults. Now we're seeing more and more families and children coming. One thing I want to point out that hasn't changed much and hasn't increased in particular is the number of known criminals who are coming. And I point this out because there's so many claims that are made about migrant criminality. And I did want to highlight this fact, right? So the CBP, Customs and Border Protection, screens arrivals through various databases and flags those with known criminal convictions in the US and abroad. It probably doesn't detect all of them, but it probably detects a fair share. And those numbers are very small. So for example, if we're talking about people who are trying to cross the border not through a port of entry, that's less than 1% of those encounters. And so increasing diversity of origins, diversity of circumstances, and a diversity of reasons for coming to the US. I want to just hit some of the main factors that the researchers found as sort of contributing to these flows. So some people are driven by economic pressures. Latin American economies always had high levels of poverty and inequality. They've been hit particularly hard by the COVID pandemic. Venezuela's economic collapse dating to before the pandemic was probably the most severe such collapse in the world over quite some time. Some people are driven by violence and armed conflict. Some of the world's most violent countries remain in Latin America. It's fed by drug trafficking and proliferation of organized criminal groups. And the number of armed conflicts in the world has proliferated. I think one of the things that the Russian invasion of Ukraine demonstrates is that the United States is not insulated from migration consequences of faraway conflicts. And a large number of Ukrainians and Russians was part of this more diverse population that we see coming to the United States. Natural disasters also tend to interact with economic shocks and violence to push more people out. And those are all push factors. They push people to migrate. At the same time, the economic opportunities available in the US are a pull factor, right? An important attraction. The US demand for cheap immigrant labor is high. Right? Many people can earn in a day in the United States what it would take them months to earn in their home countries. And I think it's a mistake to think that there's a clean separation between economic motives and other motives. Even people who are fleeing persecution might consider the economic opportunities available to them when they decide where they're going to go. Why does all this matter, these changes in the composition? But the greater variety of circumstances makes it more complicated to process people appropriately and legally, properly consider their claims. Families and children in particular pose special challenges because of their vulnerabilities and because our laws demand that they be treated in particular ways. So delving a little deeper about why these migration trends are a challenge. Now, the key fact that's sort of at the core of this challenge is that growing numbers of the people that are coming are seeking to enter the country through the asylum process. And I know Michael is going to talk a little bit more about that, but this is also a central part of the story here. Why is this happening? Well, the short answer is that the United States immigration laws are outdated. It's out of sync with present realities. What are present realities? That's a complicated question, but a big part of that is that the labor market. We have a lot of demand for immigrant labor, but no way to match willing labor with needs. Another reality is the relatively small number of refugees that the United States is resettling through the refugee resettlement program. Overall, there's just insufficient lawful paths into the country to meet growing demand. Now, under US law, anyone who expresses a fear of returning to their country because of persecution of torture, that means anybody who presents as an asylum seeker cannot be returned to their country. So logically, we see a growing reliance on the asylum system because other paths are unavailable. And so this is the only way for people to make a claim to stay. So I want to talk a little more about how exactly these arrivals are a challenge. This is something that seems obvious, but is not sufficiently appreciated in detail. But I mean, the issue is that there's insufficient resources for every government agency, particularly every DHS agency that touches the process. Customs and Border Protection, CBP, is the component that first encounters arrivals at ports of entry or apprehends them as they try to cross between ports. And CBP has to process every person, right? They have to screen them. They have to determine what should be done with each case. Now, that takes time and resources. You need personnel to do this. You need facilities where people can be processed safely and humanely. You need technology, a bunch of things, right? And CBP has really struggled to do this and also to carry out its other missions, facilitating lawful travel and trade. ICE is the component that has to detain those that have to be detained or remove those that need to be removed. They also struggle with the volume. They don't have enough detention space. They don't have enough resources to return people back to all the different origin countries. If CBP wants to remove somebody promptly, but that person expresses a fear of persecution of torture, and as I noted, the law prevents us from just returning that person back to their origin countries, then USCIS comes in. And that's the component that has to determine whether the person's fear is credible enough to prevent DHS from returning the person back. And they're also struggling to keep up with the numbers. Because every part of this, right, removing people, detaining people, screening people for credible fear, takes a lot of resources. Many people end up being simply what is called paroled into the country. Parole doesn't mean that they get legal status or legal right to be here, right? But it means they're allowed in temporarily to await a hearing in immigration court that's going to determine whether they're entitled to some relief like asylum or whether they need to return back to their country. Those are the challenges at the border, challenges of processing, but of course there's challenges that migration trends present beyond the border. Now, for one thing, host communities struggle to provide shelter and other needed support services to this large number of people. That's been a strain on border towns historically, but now increasingly it's a strain in urban areas like New York City that are also welcoming a greater number of migrants. And the strain is exacerbated by the fact that in many cases, migrants have to wait 180 days before they're able to work legally, right? So during that time, they really need a fair amount of support. The second aspect of the challenge, and I suspect, again, Michael's going to talk about this probably in detail, is that the asylum system is overloaded. At the end of 2023, there were over 3 million cases pending before the immigration courts that are going to consider asylum cases. That's a backlog that grew by about 1 million over the course of that year. Not all of those are asylum cases, to be sure, but that does mean that court dates for asylum cases are on average over 4 years in the future. And it's actually difficult to calculate a success rate for these asylum claims in a way that makes sense, but the best estimates are that a minority of cases have been granted asylum to date. Now, that may change as these more recent cases come to the courts, but that's historically been the case. These trends are a problem, I have to say, for both sides of the political debate. If you care most about protecting those in peril, it's an awfully long time to remain in limbo. And it's a problem for those people who believe that the asylum system is overwhelmingly being abused, because giving people the chance to work in the United States for 4 years may be attractive enough that people may reasonably say, hey, it's fine if I have to be returned in 4 years. I'm going to earn more in that time than I'm going to in a decade here. So this is worth it. I'm going to talk a little bit about the policy solutions that have been discussed lately. And there's, of course, many. I'm not going to pretend to cover all of them. But I did want to talk about 2 sets of policies that have been discussed a lot. Most of these were in that Senate compromise bill, you may recall, in January, that took a long time to happen, and then it happened, and then it died in a matter of days. Obviously, the bill failed, but the fact that these policies were able to gather some sort of bipartisan compromise makes it seem like they're probably the more realistic measures that are eventually going to be considered again. So this first set of measures are basically policies that make it more difficult to gain entry into the United States. Now, this includes proposals like an emergency expulsion authority. That's similar to what we had during the COVID era, the so-called Title 42 authority. Now, this would allow DHS to turn away migrants if daily encounters at the border exceed some number. For example, in the Senate bill, it was 4,000 a day for a week. Proposals typically make exceptions for asylum seekers that arrive at ports of entry, but by and large, it would turn away a large number of people. This also includes a proposal to raise the bar for the initial showing of what's called credible fear. Earlier, I mentioned that if CBP wants to return somebody promptly, that person expresses a fear of persecution or torture, USCIS has to determine through an interview whether this person has established a credible fear. Now, this proposal basically makes it harder to establish it. It's intended to reduce the number of asylum seekers who would meet the standard and are therefore paroled into the country. Another measure that wasn't in the Senate bill, but it is often discussed, was curtailing the Biden administration's current parole programs for people fleeing several nations in crisis. Basically, these programs provided lawful pathways that are outside the asylum process. They offered swift protection for Haitian, Venezuelans, Cubans, Nicaraguans, and there were similar programs for Afghans and Ukrainians. And basically, they'll allow qualifying migrants to enter the United States for 2 years, typically require them to have a financial sponsor and make them eligible for work authorization sooner. And what that has meant is that these groups don't need to show up at the border seeking asylum. They can take advantage of these groups. And intent was to have programs reduce pressure at the border. However, they have been controversial, and there's been discussion about reducing the number of arrivals by gutting these programs, basically. What other policy solutions are being discussed? There's a second set of policies. These measures focus specifically on speeding up asylum and other processing. This includes proposals that can change the asylum process to reduce the years-long wait for asylum decisions and bring it down to something like months. So, for example, the Senate bill would have created an expedited process for USCIS officers to just adjudicate asylum claims at the border, instead of sending these people to immigration court and adding to the backlog in immigration courts. There's also proposals in tandem with this, better resource USCIS, as they would need to if they're going to play a bigger role, better resource the immigration courts, and better resource CBP and ICE so they could do some of that processing a little more effectively. Now, all these measures entail hiring considerably more people, more asylum officers to screen, more judges, and more law enforcement officers for CBP and ICE. If any of these measures are adopted, are they likely to be effective? How can we think about this? So effective can be many things. Here, I'm just talking about whether these policies are likely to reduce the sheer number of people that are arriving in the southwest border without authorization. That's one goal that both sides of the aisle, by and large, seem to share. So the measures that make it more difficult to gain entry, they might reduce the numbers coming to the border to some extent, but in my view, that it probably not be nearly as much as advocates of these policies expect. In other words, it wouldn't be nearly as effective as some people claim. And that's because of unintended effects. And it's the same kind of unintended effects that we've seen before and that we have a lot of research about. So for example, during COVID, when migrants were summarily expelled using the Title 42 authority, the rate of repeat attempts to enter increased significantly. So that figure I showed you at the very beginning of increasing encounters since 2020, a large part of that happened while the US was expelling people swiftly, and yet we've seen this incredible increase. And so generally, research shows that when governments restrict one pathway into the country, migrants tend to adapt and they reorient towards other pathways. So for example, making asylum more difficult by raising the bar for credible fear might increase unlawful border crossings and increase human smuggling as migrants try to evade detection and find other paths into the country. Measures like eliminating the lawful pathways for specific nations in crisis also is very likely to backfire. After these programs were created, the number of nationals of those countries coming to the border dropped significantly. Gutting these programs is going to very likely send many of those folks back to the border because crisis conditions in some of these countries, in Haiti and Venezuela and Ukraine, they're not going away. And this all speaks to the power of the forces that push people to leave their countries and then attract them to the United States. Now, when we consider measures that speed up processing, I think the central idea is sound, right? Reducing the amount of time asylum applicants spend in the US waiting should reduce the pull of claiming asylum for weaker applicants. Right? So coming to the United States to wait for a decision for a few months is probably less attractive than waiting for a few years. And at the same time, asylum seekers with stronger claims could get faster protection. Now, this may be a sensible policy for a number of reasons, but it's not likely to have, magic, dramatic effects overnight on the numbers of people. It's going to take time to reorient the system to new asylum processes. It's going to take time to hire new people, train them, and so on. With regard to these policies, too, unintended effects are going to likely follow. Once people understand that expressing a fear of persecution isn't going to result in years of waiting in the United States, they may opt again for unlawful crossings, right, to evade detection, and that is likely to feed the smuggling industry. What would it take to address the border crises more effectively? Migration experts often point out that migration can't simply be prevented by fiat. Right? Governments can only manage it better or they can manage it less well. It is highly unlikely politically at this juncture in time, updating our outdated immigration laws would allow the United States to manage migration significantly better. As I mentioned before, the US immigration laws are just not adequate anymore to meet the demands of the US labor market for immigrant labor, and they just don't account for the kinds of powerful factors driving migration. Asylum is not made to accommodate the diversity of very compelling humanitarian situations that are happening around the world. Updating immigration laws means reforming the lawful pathways we have into the country. It's also worth mentioning policies that address the root causes, right? Those powerful push factors that motivate people to migrate. These sets of policies can include efforts to counter violence in the key sending countries, combating migrant smuggling networks, fostering economic development, and so on. Again, this is not something that works overnight. This is something we have to work on over a long period of time. And then finally, just want to mention that little can be accomplished without international collaboration. To be sure, that's been happening all along, but it is a very important component of an effective policy approach. And so I just wanted to leave you with this slide and just to have it provided because there's been a lot of facts and figures thrown out by media and reporting and pundits, especially recently, that are not necessarily based in fact. So I wanted to encourage you, to the extent that you ever want to find out what's actually going on, to use these resources to figure it out. If there are statistics you're seeing cited in the media that don't appear in one of these official DHS sources, that probably the statistic is not really based on fact. I look forward to your questions and thank you so much.
Thank you, Elina. That was great. Really appreciate the overview. Michael, you're up.
Thank you very much. I'm so glad to be part of this forum, and I'm also grateful for following. Elina did a great job summarizing the nature of the crisis that we face, and we do really face a crisis at the border, and the system really is broken, and it ought to be possible, actually, even for people who disagree quite deeply about immigration issues, to agree that we have a really serious problem right now. Before I get into the asylum system, let me just introduce myself slightly. I'm a law professor professor, so I teach immigration law. I also teach administrative law and professional responsibility for law students. For me, the most important part of my job is I'm the director of the UNLV Immigration Clinic. I'm sitting right now in our community advocacy office in downtown Las Vegas, where we have the only pro bono deportation defense center in the state of Nevada. We defend both unaccompanied kids and people in immigration detention. And the nature of the clients that we have and the challenge they face depend a lot on what's going on both at the border and in federal policy. Our program actually started in 2014, which Elina mentioned this, when we saw a surge of children arriving at the border. And that's when our work with unaccompanied kids, actually all the handprints that are behind me are handprints of kids who we've helped who arrived to the US alone and want asylum or legal residency in the US. Let me say one other thing too, I think is important to understand about Nevada and about Las Vegas specifically, that we're not literally at the border. So I actually hesitated, Maureen knows, when first asked to do this, because I'm not immersed in what's going on a daily basis at the border. And what I know of it from talking to colleagues is that it's incredibly complicated. And in fact, it often is very hard to even understand what systems are and practices are in place. And something that you'll hear say is happening in Tucson is not the same that's happening somewhere in Texas. So it's hard to summarize sometimes beyond the broadest strokes, but we'll do our best. So Elina talked about this in summer terms, and I think this is the best way to go through it, because I have to try to teach this to students as well. There's just so many layers of complexity in all of immigration law. It's famously often compared to the tax code in terms of complexity, and that's not necessarily a good thing for our immigration laws. She mentioned that the U.S. can't return people who are in danger of persecution or torture. What I put up here is the international definition of a refugee, which is also what the U.S. uses for eligibility for asylum. Focus on the letters that are in red. The classic definition of a refugee is someone with a well-founded fear of persecution on account of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. We also have a separate structure for providing protection for people who are in danger of torture, which has its own definition. Now, I could teach you, and I do this for a living, a whole semester-long law school course parsing and interpreting just that paragraph that is important in front of you. It is extremely fraught and has been subject to literally decades of litigation about what exactly it means. But what I want to actually focus on today that's probably important to understand maybe two parts of it. One is that the persecution is a relatively high bar. Torture is an even higher bar. So not every harm counts as persecution. I pulled this immigration court decisions from immigration court last year. What you can see is that 43% is the asylum granted. Then there's also other relief granted. That's the gray. Asylum is one of a family of really three forms of immigration relief that are based on fear of human rights abuses abroad. The others, withholding or removal, and the Convention Against Torture. Actually, it's a narrow majority of cases in this set. If you look at other sets, it is sometimes a narrow minority of cases that are granted when actually adjudicated. But this will vary. It varies a lot by nationality. In fact, there's huge inconsistencies built into the system. So quite infamously, your chances of winning asylum depend to a high extreme on which judge you get, as well as whether you have a lawyer or not, which is one of the reasons we do the work that we do here. Because what it takes to win asylum is very severe human rights violations, that to have even 30% of people test positive for that is actually quite a lot because of the severity of what they're facing. These are the decisions. To even get to the decision involves an immense investment of resources by multiple parties, by the courts, by different parts of the government, by people like us who are not part of the federal government, representing and helping asylum seekers explain their cases in court. The other thing is, I think that is often glossed over, that I want to make sure people understand, and I often find extremely frustrating in these discussions, is what does an asylum denial mean? I fear that when people hear that someone has been denied asylum, that they will immediately think that is because they aren't really in danger, or because they really came for economic reasons, not for fear of human rights violations. And that could certainly be true for some. But it misses something really important about who gets asylum and who doesn't. That definition, remember, didn't just end with having a well-founded fear of persecution, full stop. You have to have a well-founded fear of persecution for one of just 5 reasons. A lot of the litigation that has occurred around the definition is about the definition of those reasons. They've tended to be interpreted quite strictly. The result of that is that we regularly deny asylum to people who are in danger of rape or murder because they wouldn't be raped or murdered for the right reason. I've put up here just one quote from a actually fairly generic, very typical type of case. We see this a lot in our work at the UNLV Immigration Clinic. In fact, when we have difficult cases where our client does not necessarily win, it's more likely to be for reasons like what happened to Ms. Perez-Centeno. I think it's important to understand what we're dealing with here. Although Perez-Centeno was beaten and brutally raped and her daughter kidnapped, she failed to prove that she was persecuted on account of membership in a statutorily protected group. Because no nexus has been shown, we hold that the petition must be denied. That is typical in that case and in many that we see. There is no dispute that someone is in danger or has already been brutally assaulted and is in danger of it happening again. But often there's a great deal of dispute over just the why that happened. And we regularly deny asylum and will order deported people because they would literally be raped for the wrong reason. We have lots of data, but one thing that I wish we had data on, but I've never seen, is the reason for asylum denials, because I think that we probably would want to think about them differently if they are really because you just came here to work and you don't have any issues other than economic issues, versus someone who is in grave physical danger, but not for the right legal reason. I think a lot of people would look at that differently. And I tend to find in debates about the asylum system, that gets glossed over quite a bit. And this is what we see in our work. This is often the crux of the matter. Very important to understand under current U.S. law that a person can apply for asylum no matter how they entered the country. So even if they enter the country illegally, they're allowed to apply for asylum. This provision has now been subject to a lot of litigation and is likely to be subject to more as the government seeks to deny asylum to people who entered illegally. Now we get to the process, and I have streamlined this. The actual map of the asylum procedure in the U.S. is even more complicated than what I've tried to draw. Immigration lawyers tend to talk about 2 different mechanisms for applying for asylum: affirmative or defensive. In an affirmative application, someone who has already gotten into U.S. territory, no matter how they've gotten here, they could be on a student visa or a tourist visa, they could have crossed illegally, can mail in an application and they will get an interview at the asylum office. If they succeed, they'll be granted asylum. And if they fail at that, their case will be referred to immigration court, where they would put into what's called removal proceedings. And they can make their asylum application again to an immigration judge there as a defensive application. Denial at that stage would mean an order of removal. It's important to realize this system, which relies on the top line of that chart on USCIS, is also horribly backlogged. The government a few years ago adopted a last in, first out system, which means that today interviews happen somewhat efficiently within a few months of filing, but that's only because there's a backlog that they're literally doing nothing about. So we have clients whose cases we filed 2016-ish who actually still have not had interviews, and I'm not sure we'll ever get an interview because the government basically gave up. Here is much more relevant to what we're talking about at the border, because most people are apprehended. Sometimes they're caught. Sometimes they turn themselves into border guards. What is supposed to happen, Elina described this, is they're supposed to be put into an expedited removal process, which was really built to deal with a young Mexican man coming to work in the United States. And this expedited removal was built to allow Border Patrol to catch such a person at the border and to turn them around and deport them extremely quickly. But there is a safety valve to allow someone who's in danger to ask for asylum, after which they're supposed to be screened through the credible fear interview process. If they pass that, then they're supposed to get to immigration court for the process that I described. But this is broken down because of numbers. Only my understanding is that right now only a minority of people who are being apprehended go to the credible fear interviews, and that's because the government doesn't have the resources to do them. And so as Elina described, the step is just skipped and they're paroled into the country. The system was just not built for the numbers it's receiving, particularly given that we now have a migration flow where a very large percentage seek asylum. The system was built on the assumption that asylum would be a minority of those crossing. You should also see from this chart, though, that there's a lot of steps. And so there is a potential, I think, to streamline things. For example, one of the things that I'm interested in is the fact that someone who passes credible fear ends up having to make their case multiple times. The US government might already know enough from the credible fear interview to know whether they're eligible to grant it, and yet they still have to be passed on to another stage, backlogging another part of the system. And so there is room to streamline some things, which is extremely important when we look to solutions. What can actually be done? One thing I really hate about my job, if I'm in an Uber or just meet someone in the hallway, is if I reveal to someone that I teach immigration law, people want to know what I think needs to be done in an elevator pitch format, and I haven't mastered that. It can't be fixed solely through the asylum system, first of all. But we do need to think about how the asylum system can move faster. That process requires incredibly intensive adjudication. It's what I've spent my career doing. It's what I train students to do and what we do here at the immigration clinic at UNLV. But it is basically litigation. And I'm not sure even if Congress makes the money available that we'll ever be able to hire and train enough people to really handle the kind of numbers that we're seeing. We have a system that has assumed that asylum can only be granted after this incredibly extensive adjudication system. We actually have other visas that are granted all the time with actually faster review. And I think we need to look at the way we grant other visas, including visas for trafficking victims and crime victims, as well as family-based applications. We do know how to grant and deny visas with faster review, and at least some of that can be channeled into the asylum cases. We should only be adjudicating the really difficult cases. We should not be devoting this amount of time in every case, but that's going to require a pretty big rethink of how asylum has worked. There are models internationally we can look to, and they're historical models. In the international refugee system, this kind of individual in-depth assessment was actually always meant to be the exception. And around the world, much more group status has been used, but we've not used that in the United States very much. There's a massive need for resources to actually staff these systems, as has been mentioned. It just can't handle these numbers. What do we want from a legal immigration system? Elina said, I think quite correctly, that something that's really important to understand is that the US government can't really just turn a switch and prevent arrivals from coming. And I think this is another frustration I have in the discussion of this. There's a way in which border policy is discussed like tax policy, and Congress can pass a law to change the marginal tax rate, and it will be changed immediately because Congress has 100% control over what that is. We don't have a switch like that. That's important to understand. There is probably nothing that Congress or the president could do that would have any immediate results. There's been some research about what do migrants know about day-to-day US policy, and they don't always have perfect information at all. They sometimes have misinformation, and it's not clear that when migrants even know that they'll be treated more harshly by US authorities that it necessarily changes their opinion. I think two things. First of all, I think that the United States has been stronger because we've received migration throughout our history, and specifically people fleeing from harm, the huddled masses yearning to breathe free. And I also think generally through world history that countries that become more closed rarely become stronger over time. They usually become weaker. You want to be a country that people want to come to and think that they might be able to come to. That is a source of strength and has been for us. Also, having spent my career around the world and in this country working with refugees and migrants, I think they are great people. One thing I do not like in this discourse is that migration is assumed at the beginning of the discussion to be a problem. And I think that already starts us off on the wrong foot. Every positive trait that I was told as a child that Americans value, I think, is there double with migrants. It's so difficult to migrate, especially for those who don't have money and access to visas. It's a pre-selected group for people who are resourceful and energetic and creative, all the things that make a country really strong and have helped the United States over time. I also don't mind and actually find it exciting to be in a place where I hear lots of languages being spoken that makes other people uncomfortable. There are a lot of fraud issues that we have to deal with. But even for that, I'm going to use an analogy that actually I don't like, right? That even if you were to say analogize migration to a negative natural disaster, a flood, as it's sometimes described, I actually think in terms of policy, it's not a bad analogy, because if you have a problem of a flooding, having a government official declare we are closed to water will not solve your problem. Instead, what will actually address that is you need to think about how do you want to channel that water? Because the water is going to be coming and it is going to do something and go somewhere. And the only choice we have is how we channel it. And actually, you can turn it into a resource if you want to, or you can try to fight it and you might lose. Although I don't like analogizing human beings to a flood that could be destructive, I think that in some ways is what we face at the border. And right now we are basically thinking, well, what if we build an even higher dam? Will the water stop then? And what we find is it doesn't. It becomes very destructive. It tries to find its way around any dam we build. We would be better off building channels. And that is the alternative legal pathways, reduce the pressure on the asylum systems. We could reduce the number of people who migrate if we, as Elina described, if we addressed the reasons why they feel forced to migrate: extreme poverty and inequality, violence, political corruption and repression, ethnic strife, gang violence. All of those things need to be reduced. I would actually say, though, the United States has always had trouble addressing those problems abroad. It's actually migration is an easier safety valve than actually finding solutions. And regardless, those solutions will take a very long time to materialize, but people are literally arriving today. And the only option we have is how we receive them. We don't really have a great deal of control over whether they come. And I'll end there. And again, thank you very much for this invitation. And I look forward to the discussion.
Great. Thank you very much, Michael. Really appreciate your comments. I'm going to turn it over to Casey to give you a little bit of insight from the DHS intelligence and analysis perspective. And Casey, maybe you could introduce the group to IA's role in Nevada, if you would. Thanks.
Absolutely. Maureen, thank you so much for having me here. It's a pleasure being with you guys this morning. If I would have known the food was this good, I would have started coming to this about a year ago when I moved to Nevada. But it is a pleasure to be here with all of you today. As mentioned, I am with the Department of Homeland Security, Office of Intelligence and Analysis. We actually have 22 component agencies that make up the Department of Homeland Security. So when you see and hear that the Department of Homeland Security is part of the intelligence community, technically there's two components. It's INA, my office, as well as the Coast Guard. So you have two of the 22 agencies or component agencies that make up DHS that are part of the intelligence community. Part of the reason why I mentioned that, and as it relates to me being here in Nevada, within the Office of Intelligence and Analysis, we have a cadre of analysts back at our headquarters in Washington, D.C. that are focused on a myriad of issues. Obviously, the potential impact of what's going on overseas here to the homeland, whether it's counterterrorism, whether it's transnational organized crime, economic security. There's 4 or 5 kind of key areas that we have people that focus on those general themes, on those key intelligence themes. I'm lucky where we have an element of INA where we have people that are assigned to the field. And we have probably close to, I don't know, maybe 65 intelligence officers that are assigned to each state as well as the territories. And we serve really a multitude of responsibilities within the states or the territories that we're assigned to. By and large, our job is to ensure that there's information flow between the intelligence community and the state and local level and vice versa. Also serve as somewhat of a federal Homeland Security advisor to the governor, to the attorney general, to the secretary of state, to the state Homeland Security advisor, to leaders within the state, local, tribal environment, as well as the private sector. Shortly following 9/11, you may remember there were a multitude of changes that took place, changing the footprint of the intelligence community. The 9/11 report that came out, 2003, 2004 timeframe, I was working in the Senate at the time. They were offered up a series of recommendations, many of which were adopted, and that was that we had to have an agency that was really solely focused on serving the state and local environment. So you have the Homeland Security Act of 2002 that comes into play. You have the establishment of DHS, and as part of that, they wanted to ensure that they were putting intel officers out into the field so we could engage on topics like this with people like you. And despite all these years of being in the intelligence community, this is really unique for me in that it is an open forum. This is an unclassified setting. And believe it or not, it's kind of a rarity that we have this opportunity People like myself and my colleagues were like a fire extinguisher. They kind of crack open the glass case and they pull us out only in times of an emergency. So it's nice to be in a room with windows and to see people. Believe it or not, that's typically not the environment that we work out of. But in my role here, certainly my job is to make sure that leaders at the state, local, federal level, as well as private sector can make informed decisions. And some of the questions you're probably asking yourself are, what is the difference really between intelligence and information that we share, as well as how do we calculate threat? Those are two great questions as we lead into how we assess the threat on the southwest border. To hit the first question, how do we calculate threat? There's really a formula that we use that many of you are probably familiar with, but we look at the capability and we look at the intent. So capability plus intent equals threat. And it's a very generic equation, I guess, as you look at and try to assess threat. But generally speaking, that's how we go about assessing threat, whether it's terrorism, again, whether it's economic security, whether it's any number of themes that we look at from a threat standpoint. So as we look at these threats emanating from the southwest border, that figures into our calculus in trying to determine what the threat looks like. Difference between information and intelligence. My role is to ensure that's getting shared across all elements of government, specifically state, local, the DHS intelligence enterprise, as well as the private sector. Intelligence is information with context. So for those of you that want to know the distinction, what's the difference between information and intelligence? A lot of people juxtapose the two, or they really say, oh, I got some good intel, but they really don't have any context as to what that information is. And we're fortunate this morning, we've had two great speakers that are obviously providing numbers and they're looking at stats and trends and some of the difficulties, but they're providing that added context. And so that's a form really of intelligence on the state of the southwest border right now. That's the optic by which I view, and really we all within the intelligence community view, the threat environment. Immigration, the southwest border has consistently been an issue since I entered government service over 20 years ago. The three themes that I'm going to hit on today, very briefly: terrorism, transnational criminal organizations, and migration. I'm not touching on policy. I'm not saying what's right, what's wrong. I'm being here in an official capacity. I'm trying to stay neutral. And when you ask questions, I will certainly stay neutral in my responses as best as I can. Certainly, we have some interesting information as it relates to border security, as it relates to the threats on the border, the complex border and immigration security challenges we have faced over the last year. We assess really it's likely to continue, as you can see, and as has been told by the previous two speakers, the number of encounters that we've had really have been unprecedented over the past couple of years. I know December we had our highest encounter level, which was just over 300,000. I think it was 301,500 encounters. As Elina had mentioned, that does not mean that those are 301,000 unique individuals. Although encounters with migrants have declined since December, as I mentioned, where we had 301,000. Migrants seeking entry to the United States are still arriving at a rate that is on pace to nearly match 2022 total encounters. Now, in 2022, I believe the Customs Border Protection encounter website had us at approximately 2.38 million encounters for that full year. For fiscal year 23, I believe the updated numbers from the same website was 2.5 million. So obviously, that's an exorbitant amount of encounters that we have. Now, as part of this increase, we've encountered a growing number of individuals who are on the terrorist screening data set, also known as the watch list. And what's happening to them? I know recently we've heard that some of them have been released, and that one time or maybe even twice, there's been a big focus on that, and quite frankly, rightfully so. Also, TCOs, or transnational criminal organizations, continue to exploit this complex environment to smuggle deadly drugs across our borders, often through ports of entry, and to extort and mislead migrants seeking to enter the United States. With that said, we'll transition into terrorism. And again, just want to spend a few minutes on this, but foreign terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, and Iraq and Syria, they're seeking to rebuild themselves overseas and have been for quite some time. And they maintain worldwide networks of supporters that continue to seek harm and to attack the homeland. The terrorism threat is most likely to manifest in small cells or individuals inspired by foreign terrorist organizations and violent extremist ideologies to conduct attacks. This, according to the 2024 annual threat assessment that was recently issued by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Foreign terrorists continue to engage with supporters online to solicit funds, create and share media, and encourage attacks, while their affiliates in Africa, in Asia, in the Middle East, continue to prioritize regional goals within those parts of the world. Since the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, ISIS, their regional branch, ISIS Khorasan, you guys have probably heard a lot about ISIS-K in the news lately, partly because they claim responsibility for the attack in Russia in the concert hall, has garnered more prominence through a spat of high casualty attacks overseas, and English language media releases that aim to globalize the group's local grievances among Western audiences. Individuals with terrorism connections are interested in using established travel routes and permissive environments to facilitate access to the United States. That's something that's been ongoing for quite some time. But as you can imagine, as we move resources to certain parts of the southwest border, but of course, they're going to be one step ahead of us. They're going to alter their tactics. They're going to find other ways to enter into the United States some way. As of January of this year, there were 9 individuals that we know of on the watch list who were stopped trying to illegally cross the U.S.-Mexico border between the various ports of entry. Since fiscal year 2021, there have been 340 individuals whose names are on the watch list that have attempted to cross the southwest border. This, again, according to the Customs and Border Patrol Enforcement Statistics website. While terrorists pose an enduring threat, drugs kill and harm far more people in the United States annually. As such, this is a perfect segue into the exploitation of the southwest border by transnational criminal organizations. Looking at the TCO umbrella, we're going to focus first on Western Hemispheric TCO. So Western Hemisphere transnational criminal organizations involved in illicit production and trafficking bound for the United States and partner nations endanger the health and safety of millions of individuals and contribute to the global health crisis. Illicit drugs, including fentanyl, heroin, methamphetamine, and South American source cocaine all contribute to the global demand for drugs. TCOs almost certainly will continue to smuggle drugs into our country while also exploiting migrants for financial gain. These criminal organizations likely will seek new technologies and develop novel techniques to improve their ability to evade border security measures. Mexico-based TCOs are the dominant producers of illicit fentanyl for the U.S. market. Although there are also illicit fentanyl producers, and the fragmentation of fentanyl operations has made disruption efforts challenging, some aspects of fentanyl production are spilling over into the United States, with drug traffickers conducting the finishing stages of fentanyl pill packing or pressing in the United States. TCOs in Mexico, primarily the Sinaloa cartel, or CJNG, also known as the New Generation Jalisco Cartel, remain the primary smugglers of fentanyl and other drugs coming into the United States. These organizations continue to use bribery and violence to grow their smuggling and narcotics production operations in Mexico, and they rely on companies in China to purchase fentanyl precursor chemicals and pill pressing equipment. Traffickers in Mexico and the United States are using various additives, such as xylazine, and mixing fentanyl into counterfeit prescription drugs, which are a driving force in the increase of overdoses. What's interesting is if you go to DEA's website, they've got some great information by year, the amount of drugs that are being confiscated as it relates to fentanyl. Just last year alone, they confiscated 79 million fentanyl-laced fake pills, 12,000 pounds of powder, which equates to approximately 93.7 million deadly doses of fentanyl. As you can tell, and as you probably have seen in the news and heard from other people, we are being overwhelmed right now with fentanyl, and that is a huge concern of ours. And when you talk about transnational criminal organizations, you really can't speak of the threat they pose without incorporating fentanyl into that. And that's just one agency. That's just DEA. That doesn't account for all the other agencies at the state, local level, federal level that are actually encountering individuals that are driving along our highways throughout the United States that are being pulled over for speeding or whatever kind of stupid traffic violation. They may have a taillight out. Thankfully, these guys are not very responsible when it comes to the upkeep of their vehicle, and law enforcement really throughout the country are stopping these individuals, and they're finding large sums of this drug. China remains the primary source for illicit fentanyl precursor materials and pill pressing equipment. Brokers circumvent international controls through mislabeled shipments and the purchase of unregulated dual-use chemicals. However, Mexico-based TCOs also were sourcing precursor chemicals to a lesser extent from other nations, such as India. Transitioning over into migration, record number of migrants traveling from a growing number of countries have been encountered at our borders this past fiscal year, with some monthly decreases largely attributed to migrants exploring new legal pathways or the express fear of penalties for irregular crossing following the lifting of Title 42 public health order. Mexico since January of this year. They've actually put a presence of National Guard as well as their army. They've upped kind of the ante and putting some type of footprint along the southwest border in some areas, which kind of contribute to the decrease in the amount of encounters over the past few months. So that's not an official source. That's just what's been reported on TV and various news outlets. We expect continued high numbers of migrant encounters over the next year because traditional drivers of migration to the United States remain unchanged, and frustration with waiting for legal migration pathways may grow. Terrorists and criminal actors may exploit the elevated flow and increasingly complex security environment to enter the United States. CBP is on pace to encounter more migrants at the southern border this year than any other year except 2022, with encounters spiking just prior to the January announcement of expanded parole processes for migrants from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. Encounters spiked again just prior to the lifting of Title 42 public health order last May as some migrants rushed to enter the United States prior to the change. While our southern border remains the primary vector for migration, migrant encounters along the northern border have reached record highs as well, with over 132,000 migrants through June of last year. And I've not seen a final number through the duration of fiscal year 23, compared with nearly 68,000 migrants during that same period of time, the previous fiscal year. So it's approximately doubled. Overall, maritime migration encounters in fiscal year 2023 are down compared to fiscal year 2022. The maritime migration encounters in the Caribbean, primarily of Cuban and Haitian nationals, peaked in January, reaching a high of 5,677 migrants. Increased migration from the Eastern Hemisphere has exacerbated border security challenge in fiscal year 2023, partly because many of these migrants require additional processing and repatriation resources. Encounters of migrants from the Eastern Hemisphere have doubled from over 110,000 in fiscal year 2022 to over 228,200 through June of 2023. We expect the influx of these migrants will continue as they face poor economic, political, security, and climate conditions in their countries and use uneven visa policies across the globe to reach the United States. Individuals with potential terrorism connections continue to attempt to enter the homeland. As of just July of last year, there were 160 non-U.S. persons that were on the watch list that had attempted to enter the United States using the southwest border. This represents an increase from approximately 100 encounters in all of fiscal year 2022. Inclusion to the TSDS, or the terrorist screening data set, again also known as the watch list, ranges from known associates of watch-listed individuals, such as family members, to individuals directly engaged in terrorist activity. Let me just finish really where we started: information versus intelligence. My hope is that you've got a little bit more information. You've got a whole lot more context with this information. It's no secret that we move forward, the southwest border is going to pose a unique and challenging threat for all of us at the federal, state, local, and even private sector level. That's why it's important for us now more than ever that we bring together people from the various levels of government, from the community. We have these dialogues, and we continue to ensure that the right people are getting the right information at the right time in a timely fashion. And quite frankly, if they're not, that's largely on me as the intelligence officer for Northern Nevada, at least as it pertains to government officials, private sector, and state leadership. I do look forward to the Q&A session. I apologize, I did not have slides. Everyone else did. It was quite the task just to get talking points approved. I didn't even want to try with PowerPoint slides. Thank you for having me again. I look forward to your questions and answers.
Thank you. So as you know, we just packed an awful lot into this program. First question, I think, would go to Elina. You mentioned at the very end of your talk that it was important to coordinate with countries. Who should we be coordinating with on the international front? And to follow that, is there a country or an area that you can hold up as an example that's doing immigration right? And can we learn something from them?
On the international cooperation question, there's a lot of things that are absolutely essential for us to do to prevent greater chaos. And the obvious case is Mexico. If we don't cooperate with Mexico, our border is going to get a whole lot more chaotic. One of the reasons why it's not more chaotic is because Mexico is managing and maintaining the people who are waiting or preventing people from crossing. Mexico's ability to cater to the humanitarian needs of the people is limited. Mexico's own asylum system is is not terribly great. Collaborating with Mexico better on these things and giving it more support is just absolutely crucial. We are doing a lot of these things, but we can always do them better. For the people that are fleeing persecution and torture, the other thing that we could do is support the asylum systems of other countries in the Western Hemisphere. We have a policy interest in it that I know there's efforts to make happen. There's no way to accomplish anything to affect the flow that doesn't involve us cooperating with the countries where the people are being pushed out of. In terms of countries to handle their immigration, well, it's really tough because in a lot of ways, you think about countries that are probably most analogous to the United States in terms of the problems that they face, which are the European countries. They're not doing a great job necessarily either. When people are asked to identify good countries that are doing a better job than others, they often point to Canada, sometimes to Australia. Canada's legal immigration system, I think, is in many ways more flexible and more adept at handling the different kinds of demand that there is for immigrants. They know what kinds of people they need, and they award them points, like on a scale from 1 to 100. Where the more points you get for like education, for age, for job offers, family, whatnot, the more points you get, the more likely you are to get admitted. So they handle that well, which sort of reduces the number of people that are trying to get there. Now, of course, Canada has the advantage that the United States doesn't have, and that they don't have a border like our border with Mexico. And Canada is much smaller, right? But proportionally, Canada actually has a higher percentage of immigrants in the country than we do. One reason why we might want to study its example is that they generally tend to maintain a higher level of public support for its immigration policies than the United States, right? In the United States, as you probably know now, public opinion about our ability to handle migration is at an all-time low. That's sort of the things that come to my mind immediately for these questions, and I'm happy to hear other people's thoughts as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Elina. That's really helpful. Michael, you're welcome to pull a thread on that, but I'd also like you to talk a little bit about when somebody crosses the border seeking asylum, what documentation do they typically have on them? And is there a way to use advanced analytics or things like that to reduce the number of multiple crossings? Is there technology that can help us track when people come in, if they get sent back and they come back again? Is there additional technology that can be used? The last question is really in that asylum process. If they don't get asylum granted and they're deported, is there repercussions for that if they try and cross again?
Biometrics are taken of anyone apprehended. Obviously, if someone slips past Border Patrol, then we don't have a record of them. But if anyone's encountered by Border Patrol, I think DHS has a way, regardless of their documentation, to track whether they're encountered another time or whether they're encountered any time inside the United States later on, depending on how the case proceeds. Documentation is a really important issue. I've never liked the phrase undocumented because actually the vast majority of what we call undocumented immigrants actually have lots of documentation. It's just that they don't have the lawful permission to be in the United States. A lot of our clients have genuine passports. Now it varies. Sometimes, especially people who are fleeing persecution, I mean, you can't go to your government and get a passport or identification card. Documents are sometimes stolen by the smugglers that people have to use. Again, if there were ways people could lawfully approach a port of entry, I think fewer people would lose their documents. There are definitely cases where there's a lack of documents about people's identity, but mostly the identity is pretty clear. One of the biggest frustrations of our clients, when they are successful in winning asylum, DHS keeps their passports and documentation, which causes extra hiccups in them settling into the United States because they don't have ID to use with state authorities to get driver's licenses and so forth. It just causes delay and hardship, delays them becoming self-sufficient. But that's a bureaucratic issue, not an issue of not knowing who they are. One of the things I think is important to do is streamline the way we process asylum cases, but that doesn't have to streamline the security check. Part of having an orderly border would certainly be knowing who is there and who's crossing and being able to check who they are. I agree with what Elina said about Canada. It's not a perfect comparison. Canada's asylum system has more flexibility than ours in sorting cases that are going to be easier or harder to adjudicate. We tend to pour maximum effort into every case, which is incredibly inefficient. Canada has ways of sorting cases that are going to be obviously grantable, spending less time on them, and therefore doing the full adjudication only on the harder case.
Casey, I'm going to just follow up with a question for you. You mentioned that there's screening for the terrorist watch list, which we're all very glad to hear that, and the numbers are quite small. How does DHS handle screening for other criminal history when somebody crosses either legally or illegally?
So great question. Actually, short answer to that is I don't think there is an incredibly efficient process personally. I think by the way by which we do that, we're relying upon the individual providing documentation that is valid. That way, if we do see them again or come across them again, or even on the initial encounter, we're able to take that information, share it with partner country, run it through our databases here at the state and local level with law enforcement, maybe run through intelligence community databases. And if they're using fraudulent documentation, we have no way of knowing who these individuals are. And certainly from a threat standpoint, from a vulnerability standpoint, there's a lot of vulnerability there. That is one of our chief concerns. We don't know who a lot of these people are necessarily. And the biggest concern we have is they're using fraudulent documentation. To Mike's point, though, we do have DNA. Cheek swabs are taken when there were families that were coming across or unaccompanied minors, and they were trying to pair them up with potential family members. I mean, there were steps that we could take or that we were taking, quite frankly, to ensure that they were a family unit and trying to identify if somebody was a threat. And maybe we did have biometrics on that individual from a previous encounter. There are tools in the toolbox that we're able to use, but it's not 100% efficient. Me speaking, my experience within this organization, and I don't know that we'll ever have a perfect process.
Thanks. That's very helpful, Casey. You mentioned the role of the cartels and the transnational criminal organizations. Are they involved in organizing migrants to move, or are they just taking advantage of people on the move? How extensive is their involvement in the migration? Is it a majority of the cases, a small amount of the cases?
That's a good question. I think that we're constantly trying to assess. Got different groups, organizations, mostly transnational criminal organizations that may be territorial along the U.S. border, whether it's with Texas or New Mexico or Arizona or California. And a lot of times, if you are a family or if you are a group caravan, somebody moving through a certain part of the Southwest border, they may make you pay some kind of a fee of some type. As far as they're having their fingerprints on the movement of people, I think that it is probably in more than half the cases, but I can't give any hard numbers. I don't know what up-to-date specific numbers would be. It was that way 20 years ago. It's largely that way now as some of these transnational criminal organizations continue to proliferate, as there's infighting between the different types of organizations, fighting for territory, fighting for potentially drug or business deals. Of course, they want to control those territories. I got to imagine that there's a large percentage of the people moving into the United States that are being moved by these cartels in some way, shape, or form.
Excellent. Thank you. So we're going to have to close out. Michael and Elina, what's your takeaway message to the group? Michael, I'll start with you.
The debate about the border often gets framed in very binary terms between do we want an open border, which seems to mean chaos, or a closed border, which also kind of means chaos. I think that that's a false choice for reasons we said before. I think that it's more useful to think about, do we want an orderly border versus a closed border, or for that matter, a totally open border? There's a lot of reasons why an orderly border would be a whole lot better, both for migrants and for the United States. And if I could use one other analogy, think about going to the airport. We all need to go through TSA screening, right? To make sure that we're not carrying anything dangerous. At the airport, if anyone who's going to be a passenger on a plane tries to evade the TSA line and tries to sneak around it and get to the gate without going through the metal detector, there's no ambiguity about that. That person is up to no good. And that, in a way, makes it a lot simpler for law enforcement to know how to deal with such a person. It would be a lot easier if our border were like that too, but it's not. It's more like a situation where you have a metal detector, but it's only open to 1/10 of the number of people who need to travel, and you're not traveling for vacation. You're traveling because you need to get on that plane to avoid a desperate or if not deadly situation. And the metal detector is not open to everyone. And then what you'd end up with is a lot of people trying to get around the metal detector. Some of them might be up to no good. And a lot of them would, though, be just trying to save their life by getting to the airplane. And that's going to make it a whole lot harder for law enforcement to handle, because to sort out the person who's really trying to do real harm versus someone who's just trying to get to the gate. It's going to be really hard to sort out. And an orderly border would make it genuinely suspicious for someone to be trying to, say, cross the river rather than go to a port of entry. But that's not the border we have today. And that is making it much more dangerous for migrants. It's making it more dangerous for the United States, and it's making it very chaotic.
Thank you. Elina.
Thank you. Fully sign on to things that Michael said, and then I will just add that, the caution to everybody to be really skeptical about anybody claiming that there's any one single policy or any one solution to the border crisis. I think I tried to convey no single policy is going to have magic, dramatic effects overnight. It really requires an ensemble of measures. It's going to take time. So be very skeptical about claims of like, well, we just need to do X, right? Whatever X is. I would also encourage skepticism about claims that try to quantify the problem in some way that are coming from an ideological place or ideological position, right? People have been using and abusing numbers and statistics throughout this debate, and this was one of the reasons why I put up the sources that I believe are trustworthy, and so just be skeptical about that as well. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks. Casey.
I've been working in this business for quite some time. I've had assignments overseas, domestically, and in 6 different states, worked in Washington at headquarters for a number of years. In this time period right now, looking overall at the threat, we have got a heightened threat with state actors. We've got a heightened threat with foreign terrorist organizations. We have a heightened threat with domestic violent extremists. You go down the line, this is probably the one time in all the years that I've been working in the intelligence community where I'm actually nervous. There is a lot going on in the world, not trying to make more or less out of the situation that we have in the southwest border, but we do know that there obviously are individuals who made their way here. And quite frankly, there are people that came through legal channels and maybe their visa had expired. I know 20 years ago when we were working on a reform, we weren't trying to add CBP officers and agents. We were trying to get more HSI agents to take out the people who were here illegally that had already come through legal channels. From a threat standpoint, it's coming from inside, it's coming from outside. We're looking at threats from all over the place, and that's concerning to me. But certainly as it relates to the southwest border, you never know. It only takes one person, or 9/11, you had 11, a number of people that were providing support. You had a number of people that were actually engaged in carrying out the attack. You had people who were supposed to be part of the plot, but weren't. So you've got a myriad of folks. It was a small group. It only takes one. It only takes 5. It only takes 10. You don't need to have a large volume of individuals to come across the border or to be here from a domestic standpoint to carry out an attack. They look for opportunistic attacks, and those are the things that we are worried about at the state and local level here in the United States. I guess I just leave that thought with you as it relates to my thoughts on the current threat environment. It's very unique, the world that we live in right now.
Thank you. And thank you all. This was a tough topic. I appreciate you sticking with us. Stay tuned. We'll bring this topic back, I'm sure, again. Thank you very much. Be safe.